HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives, the lost story of enslaved Africans, their Arabic letters, and an American president. By Jeffrey Einboden. Read by Boehmer. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Prologue. On March 5, 1809, Thomas Jefferson was finally free. The day before, he had attended James Madison's inauguration, witnessing his successor take the oath of office. After 2 tumultuous terms, Jefferson was relieved of the presidency, and he could not wait to flee Washington. It was time to go home. On his first full day of retirement, Jefferson wrote only one letter that has survived, not addressed to his friends in high places. This March 5th letter was instead sent to an innkeeper in Virginia, John Benson, who had invited Jefferson to pass a day in Fredericksburg on his return home to Monticello. But Jefferson refused, offering Benson only excuses. He could not come due to the impassable state of the roads, and, moreover, Fredericksburg was 20 miles out of the way. Most important, Jefferson would not be traveling light. "I shall have a caravan also on the road ahead of me, which, in case of any casualty, I might overtake and relieve," Jefferson informed Benson. Although unburdened from office, the former president was not unencumbered in returning home to Virginia. 3 wagons would be sent before him to Monticello, carrying all types of property, including, of course, enslaved persons. Jefferson was free from office, but others in his own household would stay very much in bondage. Precisely 200 years after Jefferson's initial day of retirement on March 5, 1809, the present study took its own initial steps. On the evening of March 5, 2009, I taught a graduate seminar at Northern Illinois University and, for the first time, brought together the 2 topics that are synthesized in this book: Thomas Jefferson and Muslim slave writings. That evening, in March, my students were assigned to read selected letters by Jefferson. During the same class session, however, I also prepared students for our next topic, introducing them to Arabic writings by enslaved Muslims in antebellum America, a subject we would be covering in depth during the very next class. These disparate subjects I had deliberately set back to back in designing the course, juxtaposing Jefferson, famed author of U.S. Freedoms, with little-known writings by African Muslims whose freedoms were denied in the early United States. In 2009, however, I was entirely unaware that this surface contrast hid a literal link. Exactly 2 centuries before our class, Jefferson planned his escape from Washington, telling John Benson of the caravan that would be sent before him, packed with possessions from his presidential years. I would later come to learn that among the many materials Jefferson accrued while in office were 2 little pieces of Arabic writing penned by fugitive Muslim slaves, pieces that are published for the very first time in this book. During the decade that has passed since 2009, it has been my own travels away from home that helped uncover the sources that sustain Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives. In the months that followed my graduate class on March 5th, my interest in Muslim slave writings developed and deepened. Rather than teach documents already discovered, I turned to archival research, seeking to locate lost slave writings in Arabic. Visiting sites where Muslims were enslaved in the early nation, my search received critical support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, NEH. Applying in 2010 for my first NEH fellowship, I received funding in 2011 to 2012 for an initiative entitled Arabic Slave Writings and the American Canon, supporting my efforts to uncover lost Muslim sources for translation and teaching. Traveling first to North Carolina and later to Georgia, my early research yielded material successes, though modest. By 2012, I had managed to recover and render just a few Arabic pieces penned by Muslim slaves that were previously unpublished. During these first years of searching, it was what seemed missing in the South that proved just as significant as what I was able to unearth. Although African Muslims endured enslavement primarily in southern states, I increasingly uncovered hints that their Arabic writings had migrated north, ending up in leading archives from New England to Notre Dame. Buried among the papers of the most prominent early Americans, Muslim slave writings started to emerge in folders belonging to famed U.S. politicians and professors. To locate fresh manuscripts by Muslim slaves, it became clear that where they were written meant far less than why and for whom. The Africans who composed these documents had led lives of incarceration or were hunted fugitives on the run. And yet, their Arabic documents enjoyed free passage, making their way into the hands of the most elite U.S. figures who themselves had private interests and personal experiences with Islam, Africa, and captivity. This realization led to repeated breakthroughs in my research. By 2013, I had begun to locate lost Muslim slave manuscripts at northern sites, experiencing success especially in early America's capital of culture, Boston. It was at this city's Massachusetts Historical Society that I would find the earliest extant writings by a Muslim slave after independence, writings that have stayed hidden amid the papers of an 18th-century president of Yale. And it would also be at the Massachusetts Historical Society that I would later locate one of the two Arabic documents possessed by none other than a President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. These unexpected finds and years of travel not only yielded the source materials for Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives, but also mirror the story the book now tells. A story of improbable pursuits spanning all corners of the country, from northern cities to the deep south, from the East Coast to the far west, straddling borders of race, religion, and region. The book pairs unknown Muslim slaves with the most celebrated early Americans, linking men on the margins to the prime centers of U.S. power. It is a similar shift from periphery to prominence that also motivates Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives itself. The book aims to overturn centuries of obscurity, finally bringing to light the compositions and contributions of multiple Muslim slaves previously unknown, an aim rooted in the book's research, but which has also shaped its style. Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives is written not as a static study, but as a historical narrative. Dilating out from the pivotal year of 1807, the book unfolds a lost story of Arabic literacy and Muslim captivity centered in the life and legacy of Thomas Jefferson. Revealing subjects hidden in plain sight since the nation's first decades, Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives finds forgotten Arabic slave writings built into the very biography of one of America's most renowned founding fathers. There are dangers, of course, in exposing such historic Muslim writings for the first time within a retelling of Jefferson's own storied career. It runs the risk, in particular, of overshadowing Muslim slaves yet again, eclipsing their experiences by placing them in proximity to a towering figure in the American mind. The intent and the outcome, I trust, of Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives is precisely the opposite. There are many reasons why Muslim slaves have eluded standard accounts of U.S. origins. Some of their Arabic writings have been physically lost. Some writings that have survived still remain obscure due to their near illegibility, an issue that impacts the very manuscripts that came into Jefferson's hands. It is not the limitations of their Arabic authorship that have kept Muslim slaves hidden, however, but the limited audiences that have been presented with their stories. Despite heroic efforts by prior field pioneers, the study of Muslim slave writings still remains a narrow academic niche. Their presence is frequently overlooked within both broad histories of early America as well as targeted biographies of America's founders. Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives challenges this neglect, not only by revealing links between Muslim slaves and the nation's elite, but by presenting these links within a narrative accessible to non-specialists. The narrative shape of Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives arose from its historic materials and an aim to make these materials widely available. But narratives take time. Narratives unfold through time, of course, recounting the passage of events, advancing from a beginning to an end. However, time is also the vital resource needed to craft a narrative. For Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives, this resource was supplied by the American Council of Learned Societies, ACLS, to which I now offer my most profound gratitude. It was an ACLS fellowship in 2017 that released me from an entire year of teaching, allowing the time required to transform my source findings into this book's final narrative. Without ACLS support, Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives would not have been possible. The same could be said, however, of another institutional leader, Oxford University Press. Granted an advance contract at the very end of 2016, Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives received years of superlative guidance from the press's editors and readers, including Hannah Campineau, and especially OUP executive editor Cynthia Reed. My last stages of writing Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives built upon years of foregoing archive research, during which I not only collected rare sources, but also accumulated countless debts of gratitude. Dozens of institutions and individuals across the country supported my search for manuscripts, welcoming my repeated visits, and later granting permissions for my quotation and image reproductions from their collections. As my research migrated northward, following the trail of Muslim slave manuscripts, it was Boston that became the center of my work for several years. As I traced the origins of the two Arabic manuscripts that came into Jefferson's possession, my research in 2016 and 2017 led me away from the East Coast and into the interior, with trips to Tennessee and Kentucky. In Gallatin, I received indispensable aid from the Sumner County Archives. In Carthage, my research was facilitated by the patient guidance of John Wagoner, Jr., who oversaw my review of records at the town's courthouse, searching for any final traces of two Muslim fugitives in 19th-century Carthage. A decade has now passed since the spring semester in 2009, the semester that launched the journeys that have led to Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives. As I write these words in 2019, I am once more in the midst of another spring semester, during which I will again teach Muslim slave writings, but with a much deeper sense of their significance and covert circulation in early America. Chapter 1. A Matter of Momentous Importance. On October 3, 1807, Thomas Jefferson's evening at the President's house was interrupted by the arrival of a cryptic note. Scribbled by a traveler from the territory of Louisiana, this note was a single-page petition pleading with the president for just one thing: an interview. "I have a matter of momentous importance to communicate," the author insisted, but added no details. At its end, the note was signed with a name unknown to the president: I. Nash. The evening of October 3, 1807, marked the end to a long day for Jefferson, a day that had begun on the road. That morning, the president had awoken at Songster's Tavern, more than 20 miles from Washington, facing the last day of his return trip from Monticello, his beloved little mountain home in the Virginian woods. This 4-day journey back to the president's house had proved more arduous, even dangerous, than expected. It was not as free from accident as usual, as Jefferson informed his eldest daughter, Martha. On the way back to Washington, Jefferson's horse, Castor, had almost drowned in the Rapidan River. The aging animal was barely saved by the president's servants, who braved the waters to cut the horse loose from the carriage before he was swept under. To top it all off, Jefferson had lost his traveling money somewhere on the way, too. Jefferson reached the president's house before noon on Saturday, October 3rd. Any attempt to return to Washington routines, however, would be disrupted before the day was done. It had been more than 2 months since Jefferson had slept in his bed at the president's house, but Jefferson did not even have the chance to settle in for the night before Nash's unsettling request had arrived. A devotee of clarity and order, Jefferson had every reason to be disquieted by Nash's enigmatic note, which raised many questions. Who was this traveler, and why did he seem reluctant to write down the matter he wished to communicate in person to the president? Also troubling was the traveler's origins in Louisiana, a vast territory purchased by America 4 years earlier at immense cost and controversy, a largely uncharted U.S. space whose recent upheavals had cost Jefferson sleepless nights. By the time Jefferson opened Nash's note, night was closing in, and Saturday would soon tick over to Sunday, October 4th. And yet, no Sabbath rest would be in store for Jefferson this Sunday. The mysteries of Nash's note were simply too much for the president. Not long after reading the message he received, Jefferson decided to grant the traveler's request. Ira P. Nash arrived for his desired interview, and his note's single promise proved true. He certainly did have an urgent and significant matter to communicate. Unfortunately, if Jefferson had hoped to settle matters by meeting this traveler from the territory of Louisiana, he would be disappointed. Jefferson had not solved a mystery by granting Nash his interview, but uncovered a whole new series of puzzles. By the evening of October 4th, 1807, Jefferson held in his hands strange writings carried to him from the country's edges. Nash's matter of momentous importance to communicate turned out to be 2 manuscripts, a pair of encoded communiques written in coiled lines and delivered to Jefferson from deep in the American interior. Astonishingly, the 2 pages that Jefferson held on October 4th, 1807, were authored by 2 enslaved Africans resisting their captivity in rural Kentucky. To receive writings by an American slave in 1807 was exceptionally rare. These writings handed to Jefferson were doubly intriguing, as he was unable to read them. Penned by literate slaves seeking emancipation, the manuscripts conveyed to Jefferson from the far West were composed entirely in Middle Eastern letters. Peering down at 2 pages produced in America but illegible to its president, Jefferson scanned documents in a language that he could not decipher, but which he recognized all too well. Authored by enslaved Africans held in U.S. captivity, the pages Jefferson scrutinized were written not in English, but wholly in Arabic. Nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen to Jefferson during the first days of October 1807, and, according to the countless Jefferson biographies and presidential histories so far written, nothing extraordinary did happen. A midpoint in Jefferson's second term, the opening to October 1807 is typically overlooked, seeming a brief calm amid the impressment crisis sparked earlier in the summer. On June 22nd, the British vessel HMS Leopard had attacked an American frigate, the USS Chesapeake, off the coast of Virginia. Suspecting that sailors on the Chesapeake were British deserters, the Leopard first bombarded the American ship and then boarded it. Killing 3 of the U.S. crew, the British seized 4 other sailors, impressing them into royal service. News of the Chesapeake affair soon spread, provoking calls for retaliation from current congressmen and eliciting more nuanced responses from former U.S. leaders. The previous president, John Adams, still estranged from Jefferson after their bitter election battle in 1800, likened British impressment of deserters to the pursuit of fugitive slaves. From his unhappy retirement in Massachusetts, Adams wrote to Benjamin Rush, highlighting the hypocrisy of American outrage, noting that our people have such a predilection for runaways of every description, except runaway Negroes. The current president was infuriated too, of course, but a rash response suited neither Jefferson's high office nor his cool temperament. More muted and moderate, Jefferson struck back at Britain with economic sanctions, leading to Congress's Embargo Act, which was passed on December 22, 1807, exactly 6 months after the attack on the Chesapeake. Biding his time in between summer's open hostilities and this congressional action at Christmas, Jefferson soothed tensions at home while seeking an apology from abroad, demanding the British admit their unjust acts of aggression. As Jefferson pursued political solutions to slow diplomacy, October 1807 began. Often neglected by biographers as an empty interval, this month's first days saw Jefferson return from Monticello, arriving in Washington, where he would wait for a response to the protest he sent to England. In Gary Wills's words. But October 1807 was no vacation nor vacuum for Jefferson. The president did wait in Washington for an answer from the British Crown, but instead, an entirely unexpected message arrived, which has stayed hidden for over 2 centuries. Sent, not from a king across the ocean, the momentous manuscripts put into Jefferson's hands on October 4th were inscribed by Muslim slaves in America. Publicly, Jefferson sought to protect U.S. freedoms in the autumn of 1807, ensuring U.S. sailors were no longer detained as British deserters. Privately, at the same time, he received writings from African runaways wrested from their own country. While pleading with Britain to halt impressment of U.S. citizens, the president was solicited by 2 men impressed into U.S. slavery who were, as Jefferson would later admit, confined on suspicion merely because they cannot make known who they are. It was not the issue of impressment alone that made these appeals from captives in Kentucky seem especially resonant in October 1807. Also relevant to Jefferson was the author's religious and regional origins, Islam and Africa. The first half of Jefferson's presidency had been plagued by military clashes with Muslim Africans, warring not with the British, but with the Barbary Coast. Entering office in 1801, Jefferson prosecuted a 4-year war against Muslim pirates, combating Tripoli and Algiers, seeking to stop the plunder of American ships and capture of American sailors. The very ship at the crux of the 1807 crisis, the Chesapeake, had seen early service in North African waters and was returning to patrol this same region when it was attacked by the British Leopard. Even the president's options for retaliation against the British were restricted by commitments on the Barbary Coast, with much of America's small navy still stationed on the Mediterranean. Such overlaps between the national news in 1807 and the president's private receipt of writings from captive Muslims must have been obvious to Thomas Jefferson during the first weekend of October 1807. As the president peered down at the 2 documents delivered by Ira P. Nash, however, a final overlap lay unrecognized. Unknown to Jefferson, these Arabic documents, like the Chesapeake affair itself, owed their origins to an audacious act of navigation undertaken during the spring of 1807. In March, as the Chesapeake was refitted for its mission to Muslim North Africa, the British voiced objections to this U.S. ship's manifest, insisting that the frigate was carrying deserters. Despite warnings, James Barron took command of the Chesapeake in May 1807, beginning an ill-starred voyage that ended on June 22nd, when his ship soon succumbed to a broadside British attack, suffering injuries, deaths, and capture of crewmen. At the same time, a very different crew piloted U.S. waterways, braving the evident risk of attack and capture. Embarking, not from the coast with fanfare, this 2-man troop instead trekked furtively alongside tributaries far in the American interior. Following the sinuous bends of the Cumberland River, a pair of Muslim fugitives covertly skirted invisible borders demarcating newly born states. Driving in the opposite direction of the Cumberland's westward currents, the West Africans strove toward the sunrise, pushing slowly eastward, inching closer to the same ocean whose waters had carried them to this land of their bondage. Long before they neared Atlantic shores, however, their daring run was intercepted. Spotted by Kentuckians whose homes sparsely dotted the Cumberland River, these 2 anonymous Muslims were taken up, most likely by the end of the month of May. Failing to elude the eyes of locals, these West Africans would soon rise to the notice of the nation's capital, with news of their improbable flight, and the Arabic manuscripts inscribed by their shackled hands, carried to President Jefferson himself, ultimately reaching him 5 months later, during the first weekend of October 1807. Of all the moments in Jefferson's career, how could this particular moment, his receipt of Muslim slave writings, have been lost to history? Of all the pages held by America's 3rd president, how could these 2 pages, authored in Arabic by fugitive West Africans, have stayed submerged for more than 2 centuries? It seems that every story involving Jefferson has already been told. Long before his death in 1826, Jefferson was recognized as a historic figure, celebrated as foremost among the American founders. As early as 1809, Jefferson was labeled the first citizen of this great republic. Even before he became the nation's first Secretary of State in 1790, its second Vice President in 1796, and its 3rd President in 1801, Jefferson had forever secured his fame, authoring the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Comprehensive biographies of Jefferson abound, but so do studies dedicated to specific topics, dissecting nearly.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?